It was early 1944, deep in the heart of Texas at Camp Swift. The air, thick with the scent of pine and unfamiliar cooking, carried the usual clatter of metal trays from the mess hall. Yet, for many of the German prisoners of war, this sound wasn't a promise of sustenance, but a prelude to a profound unease. Before we explore this forgotten corner of history, take a moment to drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your perspective helps us connect these stories across the globe. These were men who had known genuine hunger, some fresh from the brutal Eastern Front, their bodies still etched with the memory of scarcity. But here, faced with a plate of perfectly edible American food, many recoiled. Imagine the scene. A soldier, his uniform still bearing faint traces of European dust, staring at his meal, a strange mix of apprehension and fear clouding his eyes. The steam rising from the dish, doing little to warm his spirit. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, a young German POW, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden bird, felt this dread acutely. Survival was his driving force. But how could he reconcile his hunger with an almost visceral fear of the very food meant to sustain him? Overseeing this complex landscape was Captain Alistair Finch, a meticulous officer whose days were governed by the well-worn Army Regulations manual on his desk. Finch's objective was simple: maintain order, adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention. Yet he wrestled daily with the paradox of upholding military protocol while confronting the inherent humanity, and indeed, the peculiar resistance of the men under his charge. In the bustling camp mess hall, the aroma of spices mingling with the sharp tang of cleaning supplies, Martha Jenkins, a local Texan woman with kind but firm hands, supervised the kitchen staff. Her goal was straightforward: to feed these men well, believing good food was a universal language. But her hearty corned beef hash, a staple of her kitchen, often met with suspicion, leaving her frustrated by the untouched plates. Unseen by most, Dr. Evelyn Reed, an Army psychologist, her leather-bound journal discreetly tucked away, meticulously observed. Her motivation was to understand enemy morale, yet she found herself balancing scientific detachment with a growing empathy for the POWs, their faces often reflecting not defiance, but a deep, unsettling confusion. How could a simple dish, a symbol of American abundance, evoke such a strong, almost physical rejection from men who were starving? Was this a subtle act of defiance, a silent protest against their captors, or something far more deeply rooted in culture and psychology, a barrier invisible to the American eye? The War Department, receiving disquieting reports of food rejection from camps like Swift, Santa Fe, and Camp McCoy, struggled to comprehend this phenomenon. A flurry of communications, at least 37 telegrams exchanged in a frantic 48-hour period in March 1944 alone, discussed prisoner welfare and morale. 2 barrack buildings at Camp Swift were hastily converted into an infirmary, not for battle wounds, but to address widespread digestive issues and malnourishment, a direct consequence of this strange culinary standoff. The infirmary, once a quiet corner, now buzzed with a low hum of discomfort. Not the sharp cries of battle, but the quiet groans of men struggling with unfamiliar diets, their bodies reacting to a clash of cultures on a plate. Dr. Evelyn Reed, her journal open to a fresh page, noted the irony. Men who had faced starvation on the Eastern Front were now suffering, not from lack of food, but from an inability to consume what was offered. She observed the pale faces, the listless eyes, a stark contrast to the robust health Americans expected from a well-fed soldier. Every Tuesday, the mess hall at Camp Swift took on a particular tension. The air, usually thick with the scent of fried meat and coffee, would carry an underlying current of apprehension. Martha Jenkins, the kitchen supervisor, a Texan woman whose hands could coax flavor from the humblest ingredients, watched from her station by the steaming vats. Her specialty, A hearty corned beef hash was often the culprit. She'd spent hours preparing it. The potatoes perfectly diced, the beef browned, the onions caramelized until they shimmered golden brown in the morning light. Yet, as the mess line shuffled forward, she saw the subtle flinches, the averted gazes. For Martha, it was a personal affront, a mystery that grated against her southern hospitality. "They eat this every day," she'd heard one young German ask, his voice barely a whisper, a mix of disbelief and quiet horror. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, clutching his small wooden bird in his pocket, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach as he approached the serving window. The hash, a mound of gray-brown, indistinguishable matter, glistened under the harsh mess hall lights. Its aroma, a heavy mix of processed meat and something vaguely metallic, assaulted his senses. He remembered the thin, watery soups of the Eastern Front, the desperate gnawing hunger. Yet this food, abundant and supposedly nutritious, triggered a profound, almost visceral revulsion. How could his body, conditioned to scarcity, reject sustenance so readily? Was this merely a matter of taste, or something far deeper, a line drawn not by choice, but by an ingrained sense of what was edible? This wasn't an isolated incident. Reports from Camp Swift echoed similar issues at Santa Fe and Camp McCoy. The War Department, buried under a flurry of telegrams, 37 in a 48-hour period in March 1944 alone, grappled with food rejection as a critical issue affecting prisoner morale, and by extension, adherence to the Geneva Convention. Captain Alastair Finch, poring over his regulations manual, understood protocol. But this went beyond regulations. It was a human element, a silent culinary war being waged not with bullets, but with forks and plates. He wondered, with growing frustration, what secret cultural code made a simple meal, a gesture of provision, into an object of fear for men who should have been grateful for any food at all. Captain Alastair Finch might have been frustrated, but the enigma of food rejection wasn't merely a matter of protocol. It was a daily reality that unfolded with unsettling regularity in the mess halls across America. At Camp Swift, the Tuesdays were particularly challenging. The scent of simmering corned beef hash, rich with onions and potatoes, usually a comforting aroma for the American kitchen staff, often hung heavy in the air, a prelude to the palpable tension that would soon descend upon the German prisoners. Martha Jenkins, her hands perpetually smelling of spices and flour, watched from the kitchen doorway, her kind but firm demeanor masking a growing bewilderment. Her goal was simple: to feed these men well, to offer sustenance that spoke a universal language of care. Yet her carefully prepared dishes, the very embodiment of American abundance, frequently met with suspicion. She often saw the dull glint of the mess hall lights reflecting off untouched portions, the steam still rising from plates that would eventually be cleared away, uneaten. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, a young man whose North African campaign had left him with a hollow ache in his stomach, felt that familiar knot of dread tighten as the clang of metal trays signaled the arrival of Tuesday's meal. He clutched the small, crudely carved wooden bird in his pocket, a silent anchor to a world where meals, however meager, were always recognizable. Survival was his primary motivation, yet each Tuesday presented a bizarre new test. He'd seen men, hardened by combat, blanch at the sight of the reddish-brown mixture, its texture unfamiliar, its origins unclear. Was it the color, the way it was mashed together, or something deeper? He often wondered what specific components of this American cuisine, symbols of plenty, could evoke such a strong, visceral reaction from men who had known genuine scarcity. Dr. Evelyn Reed, often unnoticed in the bustling mess hall, meticulously noted these reactions in her discreet, leather-bound journal. Her sharp eyes, usually observing the subtle shifts in prisoner morale, now focused on the minute details of their interaction with food. She saw the hesitant glances, the almost imperceptible shudders, the quiet huddles where whispers exchanged theories about the dish. It wasn't just a rejection of taste, it was a profound unease, a psychological barrier that transcended simple hunger. What was it about this particular preparation, she mused, that turned a gesture of provision into an object of fear, suggesting something far more complex than mere dietary preferences? What unknown culinary code was being violated here, leaving both captors and captives in a silent culinary stalemate? Dr. Reed's entries from March 1944, now housed in the National Archives, paint a vivid picture. She documented not just the refusal, but the physical symptoms. Headaches, nausea, a profound loss of appetite that defied logic. This wasn't merely distaste, it bordered on an aversion. Her observations soon reached Captain Alistair Finch's desk, adding another layer to his already complex duties. Finch, a man who lived by the book, found himself wrestling with a problem no Army regulations seemed to cover. His copy of the Geneva Convention, its pages dog-eared from constant reference, offered no guidance on prisoners refusing perfectly good rations. The War Department, receiving disquieting reports from not just Camp Swift, but also Santa Fe and Camp McCoy, struggled to comprehend the phenomenon. A flurry of communications ensued. At least 37 telegrams were exchanged between various commands and Washington in one frantic 48-hour period in March 1944 alone, all discussing prisoner welfare and morale. Was this a subtle act of defiance, a coordinated protest, or something far stranger? Back at Camp Swift, the aroma of Martha Jenkins' kitchen, usually a comforting mix of spices and simmering meats, now carried an undercurrent of frustration. Her goal was straightforward: to feed these men well, believing good food was a universal language. But her hearty corned beef hash, a staple of American wartime resilience, consistently met with suspicion. Its rich, savory scent often turning into an odor of apprehension for the German POWs. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, clutching his small, crudely carved wooden bird, would often eye the plate with a mixture of longing and dread. The glistening, somewhat congealed mass of shredded meat and potatoes, speckled with onions, seemed to him an alien concoction. He'd seen hunger, real hunger, on the Eastern Front, a gnawing emptiness that would make any food a blessing. Yet, this dish, so readily offered, churned his stomach. The texture was unfamiliar, the mixture of ingredients baffling. It wasn't just the taste, it was the very idea of it. How could he adapt to a world where even the basic act of eating felt like a betrayal of something deep within him? A culinary barrier that felt as impenetrable as the camp's fences. What unspoken rules of consumption were these Americans unknowingly breaking? And what unspoken rules were his fellow prisoners clinging to? He'd seen hunger, real hunger, on the Eastern Front, a gnawing emptiness that would make any food a blessing. Yet, this dish, so readily offered, churned his stomach. The texture was unfamiliar, the mixture of ingredients baffling. It wasn't just the taste, it was the very idea of it. How could he adapt to a world where even the basic act of eating felt like a betrayal of something deep within him? A culinary barrier that felt as impenetrable as the camp's fences. What unspoken rules of consumption were these Americans unknowingly breaking? And what unspoken rules were his fellow prisoners clinging to? This quiet internal battle was not unique to Obergefreiter Klaus Richter. Across Camp Swift, Texas, similar scenes played out in the mess hall, particularly on Tuesdays. Captain Alistair Finch, a meticulous officer whose days revolved around the well-worn Army Regulations Manual, often found himself staring at the disquieting reports on his desk. The crisp paper smelled faintly of ink and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the lingering aroma of untouched food in the dining hall. His objective was clear: run a compliant, orderly camp, strictly adhering to the Geneva Convention. Yet, these food rejection reports, marked with a growing frequency from camps like Santa Fe and Camp McCoy, were a baffling anomaly. Why would men who had faced starvation simply push away perfectly good meals? The War Department, equally perplexed, had exchanged no less than 37 telegrams between various commands and Washington in one frantic 48-hour period in March 1944 alone, all attempting to decipher this strange phenomenon. Was it defiance, a subtle act of psychological warfare, or something far deeper, beyond the scope of military protocol? Down in the bustling mess hall, Martha Jenkins, a local Texan woman with kind but firm hands, supervised the kitchen staff. The air was thick with the steam from large pots and the clatter of metal trays, sounds that usually signaled comfort and sustenance. Her goal was straightforward: feed these men well. Good food, she believed, was a universal language, a bridge across any divide. But on Tuesdays, especially, her hearty corned beef hash, a dish she'd perfected over years, often met with suspicion. She'd watch as men like Richter picked at it, their eyes wary, sometimes even a flicker of disgust. "They eat this every day?" She'd once overheard a prisoner whisper, a question laced with genuine bewilderment. Martha often grappled with a quiet frustration, wondering what exactly about her carefully prepared dishes, a symbol of American abundance, evoked such a strong, visceral reaction. It wasn't just about taste, it was about an entire worldview colliding on a plate. This wasn't merely a culinary preference, but a profound cultural barrier. What was it about shredded meat and potatoes, a staple for so many, that could conjure such deep-seated unease? The truth, as Dr. Evelyn Reed began to meticulously document in her leather-bound journal, wasn't merely about the flavor or the texture of Martha's hearty corned beef hash. It was a collision of entire worldviews laid bare on a single plate. For men like Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, accustomed to a culinary tradition where each ingredient often held its distinct place, the American practice of shredding and mixing various components into one amorphous dish was deeply unsettling. The very act of combining meat with potatoes in such a way, a common comfort food for many Americans, became a symbol of something alien, perhaps even chaotic, to the German palate. The earthy smell of the potatoes mingled with the saltiness of the corned beef, a scent that for Martha signaled sustenance, but for Klaus stirred a profound sense of cultural dissonance, a feeling of being disconnected from his very understanding of food. Dr. Reed's observations at Camp Swift, coupled with early reports from Camp McCoy in Wisconsin and Camp Santa Fe in New Mexico, painted a consistent picture. German POWs often interpreted the mixed dishes, particularly those with a mushy consistency, as food scraps or animal feed. This wasn't a conscious insult, but a deeply ingrained cultural perception. Imagine for a moment the meticulous order of a traditional German meal, where each element is distinct, served with precision. Now contrast that with a mound of shredded, blended ingredients. For many, it triggered an unconscious alarm, a primal rejection of something that didn't fit their established framework of what edible food should look like. Captain Finch, reviewing the escalating reports of digestive ailments and food rejection that filled his desk, noted that the infirmary at Camp Swift, originally designated for minor injuries, was now treating a steady stream of prisoners suffering from what Army physicians described as psychosomatic gastric distress. The sheer volume of these cases, detailed in at least 17 separate medical dispatches to Washington during April 1944, suggested a problem far beyond simple indigestion. This wasn't merely a dietary preference. It was a profound psychological reaction, an internal conflict playing out in their bodies. But what exactly was it about this specific visual and textural presentation that instilled such a deep-seated fear, even in men who had known true hunger? The answer, Dr. Evelyn Reed began to articulate in her meticulously kept journal entries from late April 1944, lay not in the ingredients themselves, but in the very architecture of the plate. For a generation raised on German culinary traditions, food was served with a distinct, almost ritualistic separation of components. A potato was a potato, meat was meat, and vegetables held their own ground. The American approach, however, often favored efficiency and a hearty blend, epitomized by dishes like corned beef hash, a mix of shredded beef, potatoes, and onions, often served with a fried egg. This wasn't an intentional insult, but a profound cultural clash, an unconscious affront to their ingrained understanding of what constituted a proper, safe meal. Imagine the muted clatter of forks against ceramic in the mess hall, the faint smell of rendered fat and boiled vegetables hanging heavy in the air as a prisoner stared down at a plate where everything was mixed, indistinguishable, a mishmash, as some called it. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, in his fragmented German diary entries, often described the hash as animal fodder, a term that echoed through the barracks. He wasn't alone. Reports from Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, cited similar sentiments, where prisoners refused to touch dishes like Brunswick stew, despite its rich aroma. The visual uniformity of these meals, where textures and colors blurred, triggered an almost primal alarm. It wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a perceived lack of control, a fear of the unknown hidden within the blend. Could it be spoiled? Was something unsanitary concealed beneath the surface? These were anxieties born not of logic, but of deeply ingrained cultural conditioning, a silent, unspoken language of food. Captain Finch, poring over the weekly infirmary reports, saw the numbers for gastric distress steadily climb, not fall. His regulations manual offered no guidance for a psychological resistance to mashed potatoes or a hearty stew. The prisoners weren't refusing to eat out of defiance. They simply couldn't bring themselves to consume it without feeling ill. This wasn't a conscious act of rebellion, but a profound, almost involuntary bodily rejection. The very food meant to nourish them was paradoxically making them sick, transforming the mess hall into a subtle battleground of cultural understanding. The question then shifted from why they feared it to what this widespread unconscious rejection meant for the broader management of the POW camps, and crucially, for the psychological warfare efforts aimed at breaking enemy morale. If food, the most basic sustenance, could become a source of such profound internal conflict, what other unseen battles were being fought within the minds of these prisoners? The War Department, initially puzzled by the persistent reports, began to shift its understanding. The widespread food rejection from Camp Swift and other facilities wasn't simply about nutritional intake. It was a profound signal of psychological and cultural disconnect. Dr. Reed's meticulous journal entries, cross-referenced with similar observations from other camps, highlighted the urgent need for a more nuanced approach. The initial assumption that food is food gave way to the difficult realization that sustenance, especially in captivity, is deeply entwined with identity, memory, and dignity. Ultimately, the paradox of hungry men recoiling from a meal made sense through this lens. It wasn't defiance, but a visceral rejection of the unfamiliar, a subconscious act to preserve a last bastion of cultural self in a world stripped of nearly everything else. The immediate consequence saw revised dietary guidelines, with some camps experimenting with ingredients and preparation methods closer to European norms. A small, yet significant concession. In the longer term, these insights subtly influenced post-war humanitarian efforts, emphasizing cultural sensitivity in aid distribution around the globe. The story of the feared dish at Camp Swift isn't just a footnote in history. It's a stark reminder that even the most basic human needs can become complex battlegrounds of understanding. If this unexpected insight into human nature during wartime resonated with you, consider subscribing to Whispers from WW2 for more untold stories that challenge our perceptions. And tell us, what other seemingly everyday objects do you think carry such hidden cultural weight?